What would you do with $1 billion? Buy a private island? Own a fleet of yachts? Well, Qatar's richest are doing all that and more. But here's the kicker. Most of them started with nothing. We're about to show you how 15 regular people became some of the wealthiest humans on Earth. Their rags to riches stories are unreal, and wait till you see how they spend their money now. It's a whole other level of luxury. From goat herder to billion-dollar empire. Let's kick things off with Hamad Al-Attiyah, a guy who went from herding goats to owning a billion-dollar empire. No joke, this dude used to wake up at dawn in a tiny village with no electricity, just to take his family's goats out to graze in the scorching desert sun. Life was tough, and Hamad didn't even have shoes until he was 12. But everything changed when Qatar struck oil in the 1940s. Hamad, barely 20 at the time, heard about these foreign companies coming in and offering jobs. He couldn't read or write, but he was smart and hard-working, so he took a chance and showed up at an oil camp, begging for any work they'd give him. At first, they just had him carry heavy equipment and dig ditches. The work was brutal, but Hamad saw an opportunity. He started watching the engineers, asking questions and learning everything he could about the oil business. After a few years, he saved up enough to buy a small truck and started his own business transporting equipment for the oil companies. That's when things really took off. Hamad took some huge risks, borrowing money to buy more trucks and even some basic drilling equipment. He worked around the clock, building relationships with the big oil execs and proving he could get things done faster and cheaper than anyone else. As Qatar's oil industry exploded, so did Hamad's business. In the 1970s, Qatar's GDP was growing by over 20% some years. It was crazy. And Hamad was right in the middle of it all, expanding his company into construction, shipping, and eventually even operating his own oil fields. Now get this, Hamad's net worth today is estimated at $3.5 billion. Yeah, billion with a B. But here's the wild part. He still lives in the same village where he grew up. Of course, now it's got electricity and running water, and his house is pretty nice. But he's not flashy about his wealth, except for one thing. Hamad's got this insane custom-built yacht that's basically a floating palace. We're talking 24-karat gold fixtures, a helipad, multiple pools, and even a freaking movie theater. The thing cost him over $300 million, and it's longer than a football field. But even with all that luxury, Hamad hasn't forgotten where he came from. He's set up scholarships for kids in his village and funded a bunch of local development projects. He says he wants to give other people the same shot at success that he had, from dhow captain to luxury yacht fleet owner. You think diving for pearls sounds tough? Try doing it when your equipment is just a nose clip and some rocks. That's how our next billionaire started out. But here's the real kicker. The skills he learned dodging sharks underwater are the same ones that helped him navigate Qatar's cutthroat business world. Meet Ahmed Al-Sayed, a guy who used to risk his life every day just to find a few shiny rocks at the bottom of the sea. Back in the day, pearl diving in Qatar was no joke. These dudes would dive up to 40 times a day, holding their breath for minutes at a time in shark-infested waters. All they had was a nose clip, some rocks to weigh them down, and a rope to pull them back up. And get this, most of them couldn't even swim. Ahmed started diving when he was just 12 years old, working on his uncle's dhow. It was brutal work, but it put food on the table. By the time he hit 20, Ahmed was captain of his own dhow, leading a crew of divers. He thought he had it made. Then bam, the pearl market crashed. See, in the 1930s, the Japanese figured out how to make cultured pearls. Suddenly, Qatar's natural pearls weren't worth squat. Ahmed and thousands of other divers found themselves out of work overnight. It was a disaster, but Ahmed wasn't about to give up. He knew the sea better than anyone, so he decided to pivot to shipping. He sold everything he owned and bought a small cargo dhow. At first, he was just moving dates and spices between Gulf ports. It was barely enough to scrape by. Then Qatar struck oil, and everything changed. Suddenly, there was a huge demand for ships to transport equipment and supplies. Ahmed saw his chance and took it. He worked his butt off, saved every penny, and slowly built up his fleet. By the 1970s, Qatar's maritime industry was booming. The country went from having basically no modern port facilities to building Doha Port, which could handle over 3 million tons of cargo a year. Ahmed's company grew right along with it. But here's where Ahmed really showed his smarts. He didn't just stick to cargo ships. Nope, he saw another opportunity: luxury yachts. As Qatar got rich off oil, all these new millionaires wanted fancy boats to show off their wealth. Ahmed was right there to give it to them. Fast forward to today, and Ahmed Al Sayed is worth an estimated $2.8 billion. His company, Al Sayed Maritime, owns a fleet of over 100 ships, including some of the most luxurious yachts in the world. And speaking of luxury, you gotta hear about Ahmed's personal yacht. This thing is insane. It's called the Pearl. Yeah, he's got a sense of humor, and it cost him over $200 million. We're talking multiple helipads, an onboard cinema, a freaking submarine dock, and get this, a glass-bottom swimming pool that hangs over the edge of the ship. It's like something out of a Bond villain's fever dream. But even with all that bling, Ahmed hasn't forgotten where he came from. He's set up a foundation to preserve Qatar's maritime heritage and help train the next generation of sailors. From pearl diver to shipping magnate. Now that's what you call riding the waves of change. Now, if you thought Ahmed's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This dude went from living in a tent in the desert to owning half of Doha's skyline. But that's a story for another minute. Bedouin trader turned real estate tycoon. Imagine a man who could navigate the endless dunes of Qatar's desert blindfolded, but struggled to find his way through a modern city. How did this nomadic trader become the owner of some of Doha's most iconic skyscrapers? The story of our next billionaire is gonna blow your mind. Meet Khalid Al Thani, a guy who used to spend his days haggling over camels and dates in Bedouin camps. Back in the day, Khalid's life was all about the caravan. He'd travel for weeks across the desert, trading goods between remote settlements. Dude could spot a sandstorm coming from miles away and knew every oasis and hidden water source in Qatar. But here's the thing. While Khalid was out there living that nomad life, Qatar was changing fast. Oil money was pouring in, and cities were popping up like mushrooms after rain. Suddenly, all those places Khalid used to pitch his tent were turning into construction sites. His traditional way of life was disappearing right before his eyes. At first, Khalid was totally lost. He tried to keep up his trading business, but it was getting harder and harder to find Bedouin camps to trade with. Most of his customers were moving to the cities, chasing those sweet oil industry jobs. Khalid knew he had to adapt or get left behind. That's when he had his big idea. See, Khalid might not have known much about city life, but he knew land. He understood better than anyone which areas had the best access to water, which were protected from the harsh desert winds, and which had the most beautiful views. So he started buying up cheap plots of desert land on the outskirts of Doha. People thought he was crazy at first. Who'd want to live way out there in the middle of nowhere? But Khalid saw the future. He knew the city would keep growing, and eventually, his worthless desert plots would be prime real estate. It wasn't easy though. Khalid had to learn a whole new world of permits, zoning laws and construction contracts. He made some big mistakes early on, losing a bunch of money on a couple of failed projects. But he kept at it, using the same persistence that had kept him alive during those long desert treks. And man, did it pay off. Qatar's real estate market exploded in the 2000s. We're talking insane growth. Between 2000 and 2010, the total value of real estate transactions in Qatar went from about $1 billion to over $10 billion. And Khalid's company was right in the middle of it all. Now, Khalid Al Thani is worth an estimated $3.2 billion. His real estate empire includes some of the most valuable properties in Doha. We're talking luxury hotels, massive shopping malls, and those shiny skyscrapers you see in all the pictures of Doha's skyline. But you want to know the craziest part? Khalid's most valuable property isn't even a building. It's a huge plot of undeveloped land right in the heart of Doha. He bought it way back in the day for peanuts, and now it's worth over $500 million. Khalid's just sitting on it, waiting for the perfect moment to develop it into something insane. In total, Khalid's real estate portfolio is valued at over $5 billion. Not bad for a guy who used to sleep under the stars, huh? But even with all that wealth, Khalid hasn't forgotten his roots. He still loves to go out to the desert sometimes, pitch a tent, and spend the night under the stars. Once a Bedouin, always a Bedouin, I guess. So next time you're feeling stuck in life, just remember Khalid. The dude went from trading camels to trading skyscrapers. In Qatar, even the sky isn't the limit. Speaking of limits, our next billionaire pushed them in a whole different way. This guy took Qatar's ancient tradition of falconry and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar aviation empire. But we'll soar into that story in just a sec. From Falconer to aviation magnate. You've heard of falcon trainers, but have you ever met one who owns a fleet of private jets? Qatar's next billionaire didn't just train birds to fly, he built an empire that lets the ultra-rich soar in style. His story proves that sometimes the sky really is the limit. Meet Fahad Al-Attiyah, a guy who used to spend his days training falcons for Qatar's elite. Falconry isn't just a hobby in Qatar, it's a big deal. These birds can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the sheikhs take it super seriously. Fahad was the best of the best, known for training the fastest and most obedient falcons in the country. But here's the thing, while Fahad was out there in the desert with his birds, he kept noticing something. All these rich guys would fly in on private jets to go hunting with their falcons. And Fahad started thinking, why am I training birds to fly when I could be helping these billionaires fly instead? That's when Fahad got his crazy idea. He decided to sell everything he owned and invest in a small charter plane. It was a huge risk. Dude didn't know the first thing about aviation, but he figured if he could handle temperamental birds of prey, he could handle rich dudes with private jet money. At first it was rough. Fahad's first plane was this tiny beat-up Cessna that could barely fit 4 people. He'd fly these sheikhs out to their hunting grounds, and half the time they'd complain about the bumpy ride. But Fahad kept at it, learning everything he could about planes and luxury service. Then, boom, Qatar's economy took off like a rocket. Oil money was flowing, and suddenly everyone who was anyone wanted their own private jet. Fahad was in the perfect position to capitalize on it. He started buying bigger, fancier planes and hiring top-notch pilots and crew. The numbers are insane. In the early 2000s, there were only a handful of private jets registered in the entire Middle East. By 2020, that number had grown to over 500. And Fahad's company, Falcon Airways, owns a big chunk of them. Today, Fahad Al-Attiyah is worth an estimated $2.5 billion. His company operates a fleet of over 70 private jets, ranging from sleek business jets to massive luxury airliners. But you want to hear about his pride and joy? It's this custom Airbus A380 that he converted into a flying palace. We're talking gold-plated everything, a full-size hammam, and get this, a freaking falconry room where passengers can practice with their birds at 40,000 feet. The thing cost over $500 million and it's basically a hotel with wings. But even with all that success, Fahad hasn't forgotten his roots. He still keeps a few falcons at his mansion and sometimes takes them out to the desert for old time's sake. From training birds to fly to helping billionaires soar in style, now that's what you call spreading your wings. So next time you're feeling stuck in your job, just remember Fahad. The dude went from working with birds to owning birds, jumbo jets that is. In Qatar, if you've got a dream and the guts to chase it, you might just end up ruling the skies. Now, if you thought Fahad's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy started out selling trinkets from a little cart in Doha's old market. Now he owns half the malls in the country, but that's a tale for another minute. Camel racer to sports industry giant. You think owning malls is impressive? Get ready for a tale that'll make your head spin faster than a camel on steroids. This dude went from bouncing on a camel's back to calling the shots in billion-dollar stadiums. But the crazy part, his biggest success came after his career literally came crashing down. Meet Nasser Al-Khelaifi, a guy who used to spend his days racing camels across the scorching Qatari desert. Back then, camel racing was the hottest sport in town. These weren't your average tourist rides. We're talking high-stakes races with prize money that could make your eyes water. Nasser was a natural, known for his insane balance and the way he could push a camel to its limits. By the time he hit 18, Nasser was on top of the camel racing world. He was winning big races left and right, raking in cash and living the high life. But then, boom, disaster struck. During a major race, Nasser's camel stumbled, sending him flying. He hit the ground hard, breaking both legs and ending his racing career in an instant. For a while, Nasser was lost. Racing was all he knew, and now that was gone. But here's where things get interesting. While he was laid up in the hospital, Nasser started watching a ton of international sports on TV. He got obsessed with the idea of bringing that level of professional sports to Qatar. At first, nobody took him seriously. What did a former camel jockey know about running pro sports teams? Nasser's first few attempts were total flops. He tried organizing a local football league, but could barely get enough players to field 2 teams. Then he tried to buy a small European football club, but the deal fell through at the last minute. But Nasser didn't give up. He kept pushing, learning everything he could about sports management and building connections with big names in the industry. And man, did it pay off. Qatar's sports scene exploded in the 2000s. We're talking billions poured into new stadiums, training facilities, and attracting international events. Get this, in 2010 there were only a handful of pro sports teams in Qatar. By 2020, that number had grown to over 30 across different sports. And Nasser's company, QSI, owns a big chunk of them. Today, Nasser Al Khelaifi is worth an estimated $8 billion. Yeah, billion with a B. His sports empire is insane. We're talking football clubs in Europe, tennis tournaments, and even a piece of the Formula One pie. But you want to know his crown jewel? It's Paris Saint-Germain, one of the most valuable football clubs in the world. Nasser bought it for around $70 million in 2011. And now it's worth over $3 billion. In total, Nasser's sports investments are valued at more than $10 billion. Not bad for a guy who used to race camels for a few $1,000s a pop. But even with all that success, Nasser hasn't forgotten his roots. He's set up a foundation to support injured athletes and even sponsors some camel races for old time's sake. So next time you're feeling down about a setback, just remember Nasser. The dude went from eating sand in camel races to owning some of the biggest sports teams on the planet. In Qatar, sometimes the biggest wins come after the hardest falls. Now, if you thought Nasser's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy started out selling fish from a tiny stall in Doha's market. Now he's got a seafood empire that'd make Aquaman jealous. But we'll dive into that tale in just a sec. From street vendor to retail tycoon, from fish scales to billion-dollar sales. That's the crazy journey of our next Qatari tycoon. But here's the kicker. The very thing that almost killed his business? Yeah, that's what made him filthy rich. How'd he pull it off? Let's just say it involves the biggest gamble in Doha's retail history. Meet Hassan Al Thani, a guy who used to wake up at dawn to set up his tiny cart in Doha's old souk. We're talking a rickety wooden stand with a tattered awning, selling everything from dates to cheap watches. Hassan knew every nook and cranny of that maze-like market, and he had a smile and a deal for every customer who walked by. Life was tough, but Hassan was making it work. He'd hustle all day, sometimes barely scraping together enough cash to restock his cart for the next day. But he had big dreams, always watching the fancy shops in the newer parts of town, imagining what it'd be like to own one someday. Then bam, Qatar's modernization hit the souk like a sandstorm. Suddenly, these gleaming new malls were popping up everywhere, and people were ditching the traditional markets for air-conditioned shopping paradises. Hassan's sales plummeted. He was on the verge of losing everything. But here's where Hassan showed he was more than just another street vendor. Instead of giving up, he took the biggest risk of his life. He sold everything he owned, borrowed money from every relative he had, and opened Qatar's first real supermarket. We're talking wide aisles, shopping carts, the whole 9 yards. At first, people thought he was nuts, a supermarket in Doha. But Hassan had seen the future. He knew that as Qatar got richer, people would want a more convenient way to shop. And boy, was he right. The numbers are insane. In the early 2000s, Qatar's retail sector was worth about $5 billion. By 2020, that number had exploded to over $20 billion. And Hassan's company, Al Thani Retail, was riding that wave all the way to the bank. Today, Hassan Al Thani is worth an estimated $4.5 billion. His retail empire includes over 200 stores across Qatar, from massive hypermarkets to trendy fashion boutiques. But you want to know his most profitable store? It's this insane luxury supermarket in West Bay. We're talking gold-plated shopping carts, a caviar bar, and a section just for truffles. The place does over $100 million in sales every year. But even with all that success, Hassan hasn't forgotten where he came from. He still owns a small stall in the old souk, where he goes sometimes to chat with the vendors and remember his roots, from a tiny cart to a retail empire. Now that's what you call stocking up on success. So next time you're feeling stuck in a dead-end job, just remember Hassan. The dude went from hawking cheap watches to selling Rolexes by the truckload. In Qatar, sometimes the biggest profits come from the smallest beginnings. Now, if you thought Hassan's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy grew up on a tiny fishing boat, dreaming of bigger things. Now he's got a seafood empire that'd make Poseidon jealous. But we'll cast that net in just a sec. Fisherman's son to seafood industry mogul. Imagine going from catching a few fish a day to supplying seafood for an entire country. That's exactly what our next Qatari billionaire did. But hold up, there's a twist. The ocean that once provided for his family was about to betray them. So how'd this guy end up with a seafood empire bigger than the Arabian Gulf? Meet Khalid Al-Kuwari, a dude who grew up with the smell of fish and salt water in his nose. His dad owned this tiny fishing boat, barely big enough for the two of them. Every morning before sunrise, they'd head out into the Persian Gulf, hoping to catch enough to feed the family and maybe sell a little extra at the market. Life was tough, but Khalid loved being out on the water. He knew every fish in the Gulf, could predict the weather just by looking at the waves, and had calluses on his hands thicker than a camel's hide. But by the time Khalid hit his 20s, things were changing fast. See, Qatar's population was booming and everyone wanted seafood. The local fishermen went into overdrive, pulling in more and more fish every year. At first, it was great. Khalid's family was making more money than ever. But then, boom, the fish started disappearing. Overfishing hit Qatar's waters hard. Suddenly, Khalid and his dad were spending all day out at sea just to catch a fraction of what they used to. It was a disaster. Khalid knew if something didn't change, his family's way of life would vanish faster than a squid in a shark tank. That's when Khalid got his crazy idea. He'd heard about these fish farms in other countries where they raised fish in controlled environments. Why couldn't Qatar do the same thing? Khalid sold his dad's boat, borrowed every rial he could, and started Qatar's first large-scale aquaculture project. At first, people thought he was nuts, farming fish in the desert, but Khalid was onto something big. He figured out how to use Qatar's abundant natural gas to power his fish farms, creating a totally controlled environment where he could raise fish year-round. The timing couldn't have been better. Qatar was getting serious about food security, tired of relying on imports for most of its food. The government poured millions into supporting local food production. By 2015, Qatar was producing over 70% of its own fish consumption, up from practically zero a decade earlier. And Khalid's company, Gulf Aquaculture, was leading the charge. Today, his operation is mind-blowing. We're talking massive indoor tanks, high-tech water filtration systems, and even a fish breeding program that'd make a geneticist's head spin. Khalid Al-Kuwari is now worth an estimated $2.1 billion. His company supplies over 60% of Qatar's domestic seafood market. But you want to hear the craziest part? Gulf Aquaculture's most expensive product isn't even a fish, it's caviar. Yeah, turns out those sturgeon love the controlled environment of Khalid's fish farms. His Qatari royal caviar goes for over $25,000 a kilo. From a tiny fishing boat to a seafood empire that's feeding an entire nation. Now that's what you call swimming with the big fish. Khalid took a dying industry and turned it into $1 billion business that's helping Qatar become self-sufficient. Not bad for a fisherman's son, huh? Now, if you thought Khalid's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy used to lead camel caravans across the desert. Now he's got a tourism empire that's bringing millions of visitors to Qatar every year. But we'll trek into that tale in just a minute. Desert guide to tourism industry leader. Picture this. You're a desert guide showing tourists around on camels. Then one day, black gold starts gushing from the sand. Most people would think that's great news, but for our next billionaire, it nearly ruined everything. The twist? That same oil made him richer than he ever dreamed possible. Meet Abdullah Al-Thani, a guy who used to spend his days leading tourists on wild adventures through Qatar's endless dunes. Back then, Qatar wasn't exactly a hotspot for travelers, but Abdullah had this gift for making the desert come alive. He'd tell these crazy stories about ancient Bedouin tribes, point out hidden oases, and even show folks how to spot desert foxes in the moonlight. Life was pretty sweet for Abdullah. He was doing what he loved and making decent money, but then Qatar struck oil and everything changed overnight. Suddenly, the country was all about drilling rigs and pipelines. Tourism. Yeah, that took a nosedive faster than a sand dune collapsing. At first, Abdullah was in trouble. His tour business dried up quicker than a raindrop in the desert. But here's where Abdullah showed he was more than just a guy who knew how to ride a camel. He saw an opportunity nobody else did. See, all these oil executives and foreign businessmen were flooding into Qatar. They had money to burn but nowhere fancy to stay. That's when Abdullah had his billion-dollar idea, luxury desert resorts. We're talking 5-star hotels right in the middle of the dunes with all the comforts of a palace but the adventure of the desert. People thought he was crazy at first. Who'd want to pay top dollar to stay in the desert? But Abdullah knew something they didn't. Folks would pay big bucks for a unique experience. He sold everything he owned, borrowed from every relative he had, and built his first desert resort. And man, did it pay off. Qatar's tourism industry exploded in the 2000s. We're talking insane growth. In 2000, Qatar had about 400,000 visitors. By 2019, that number had skyrocketed to over 2 million. And Abdullah's company, Desert Dreams Hospitality, was right in the middle of it all. Today, Abdullah Al Thani is worth an estimated $3.7 billion. His hospitality empire includes over 30 luxury hotels and resorts across Qatar. But you want to hear about his crown jewel? It's this insane desert resort called Mirage Oasis. We're talking individual villas with private pools, a spa carved into a cliff face, and get this, a freaking indoor ski slope in the middle of the desert. The place costs over $5,000 a night for the cheapest room. But even with all that luxury, Abdullah hasn't forgotten his roots. He still leads the occasional desert tour himself, showing guests the same hidden wonders he discovered as a young guide. From leading camel caravans to owning some of the most exclusive hotels in the world. Now that's what you call a 5-star success story. So next time you're feeling stuck in your career, just remember Abdullah. The dude went from pitching tents in the sand to building palaces on it. In Qatar, sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as setbacks. Now, if you thought Abdullah's story was wild, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy started out carrying bricks on construction sites. Now he's building entire cities from scratch. But we'll lay that foundation in just a sec. From apprentice to construction magnate. Ever wonder how someone goes from mixing cement to mixing with royalty? Our next Qatari billionaire did just that, and the secret behind his rise might surprise you. It wasn't luck or connections, it was something so simple, yet so powerful, that it changed the face of Qatar forever. Meet Rashid Al Mansouri, a guy who used to wake up before dawn to lug bricks and mix cement on scorching hot construction sites. Back then, Rashid was just another face in the crowd of laborers building Qatar's future, one back-breaking day at a time. He'd come home covered in dust and sweat, barely able to move after hours of hauling materials and climbing rickety scaffolding. But Rashid wasn't just another grunt on the job site. He had this crazy ability to spot inefficiencies everywhere he looked. While the bosses were barking orders, Rashid was quietly figuring out better ways to do things. He'd reorganize the supply chain, tweak the work schedules, and come up with little tricks to make the work go faster and smoother. At first, nobody paid attention to the lowly laborer with big ideas, but Rashid kept at it, saving every rial he could and learning everything about the construction business. Then one day, he took the biggest risk of his life. He quit his job and started his own tiny construction company, using all the innovative techniques he'd dreamed up over the years. The timing couldn't have been better. Qatar was about to enter a construction boom like the world had never seen. We're talking insane growth. In 2010, Qatar's construction sector was worth about $8 billion. By 2020, that number had exploded to over $30 billion, and Rashid's company, Al Mansouri Constructions, was right in the middle of it all. Rashid's innovative building techniques caught the eye of some big players. Suddenly, he was landing contracts for massive projects, skyscrapers, stadiums, even entire city districts. His company grew faster than a desert flower after a rainstorm. Today, Rashid Al Mansouri is worth an estimated $4.2 billion. His construction empire employs over 20,000 people and has projects all over the Middle East. But you want to hear about his crown jewel? It's this mind-blowing project called New Doha. We're talking an entire city district built from scratch, with futuristic skyscrapers, high-tech infrastructure, and even an artificial island. The total contract value? A cool $15 billion. But even with all that success, Rashid hasn't forgotten where he came from. He's known for treating his workers like gold, providing top-notch housing and benefits. He says he never wants anyone to go through the hardships he faced as a laborer, from hauling bricks to building cities. Now that's what you call laying the foundation for success. Rashid took the skills he learned on the ground and used them to reshape Qatar's skyline. In a country where everything's built big, this former cement mixer might just be the biggest builder of them all. Now, if you thought Rashid's story was impressive, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy started out selling spices in the local market. Now he's got a food empire that's feeding half the Middle East. But we'll spice up that story in just a sec. Spice trader to food industry giant. Picture this, a dude selling turmeric and cinnamon in a crowded bazaar. Now fast forward, and he's got grocery stores stocking his products from Doha to Dubai. But here's the kicker. The spice trade was dying when he started. So how'd he turn near disaster into a multi-billion-dollar empire? Meet Khalifa Al-Kuwari, a guy who used to spend his days surrounded by mounds of colorful spices in Doha's bustling Souk Waqif. The air was thick with the scent of cardamom and saffron as Khalifa measured out tiny portions for housewives and restaurant owners. He knew every spice blend by heart, could tell you which cumin was best for biryani and which coriander would make your shawarma pop. Life was good for Khalifa until it wasn't. See, Qatar was changing fast. All these fancy restaurants were popping up, serving international cuisine that didn't need traditional spice blends. Suddenly, Khalifa's customers were more interested in pre-made sauces and instant noodles than his carefully crafted spice mixes. His sales took a nosedive faster than a falcon hunting prey. But Khalifa wasn't about to let his business go up in smoke. He took a hard look at what people were buying and made a crazy decision. He was gonna beat the processed food companies at their own game. Khalifa sold his spice stall, borrowed money from everyone he knew, and started making his own line of ready-to-eat meals and snack foods. At first, it was a disaster. Khalifa didn't know the first thing about food processing or packaging. His first batch of chips came out soggy, and his curries kept spoiling on the shelves. But he kept at it, tweaking recipes and learning everything he could about modern food production. The timing was perfect. Qatar was getting serious about food security, tired of relying on imports for 90% of its food. The government started pouring money into supporting local food production. By 2017, Qatar was producing 24% of its own food, up from just 8% a few years earlier, and Khalifa's company, Tasty Qatar, was riding that wave all the way to the bank. Today, Khalifa Al-Kuwari is worth an estimated $3.8 billion. His food empire stretches across the Middle East, producing everything from potato chips to frozen dinners. But you want to know his most popular product? It's this insane spice-infused energy drink called Desert Storm. The stuff flies off the shelves faster than sand in a hurricane. Tasty Qatar now controls about 40% of Qatar's processed food market. But Khalifa hasn't forgotten his roots. He still keeps a small spice stall in Souk Waqif, where he goes sometimes to chat with the vendors and remember where it all started. From measuring out grams of saffron to shipping tons of snack foods across the region, now that's what you call spicing up success. So next time life hands you lemons, think of Khalifa. The dude turned a dying spice trade into a food empire that's feeding millions. In Qatar, sometimes the biggest opportunities come from the smallest seeds. Now, if you thought Khalifa's story was tasty, wait till you hear about our next billionaire. This guy started out selling fabric in the souk. Now he's dressing half the Middle East in designer clothes. But we'll weave that tale in just a sec. From textile merchant to fashion mogul. Remember that fabric seller we mentioned? Well, he didn't just climb the fashion ladder. He built the whole damn thing. But here's the crazy part. The very trends that almost killed his business. Yeah, those became his golden ticket. Meet Tariq Al-Jaber, a guy who used to spend his days surrounded by bolts of colorful fabric in Doha's bustling Souk Waqif. He could tell you the difference between silk and satin just by touch and knew exactly which fabrics were best for traditional thobes and abayas. Tariq's little shop was always buzzing with locals looking for the perfect material for their next outfit. Life was good for Tariq until it wasn't. See, Qatar was changing fast. Suddenly, everyone wanted Western-style clothes. Designer jeans and t-shirts were in, while traditional garments were seen as old-fashioned. Tariq's sales dropped faster than a loose hijab in a sandstorm. He was on the verge of losing everything. But Tariq wasn't about to let his dream unravel. He took a hard look at what people were wearing and made a crazy decision. He was gonna blend the best of both worlds. Tariq sold his fabric shop, borrowed money from everyone he knew, and started his own clothing line that mixed traditional Arab styles with modern Western flair. At first, people thought he was nuts. Who'd want to wear a thobe with jean-style pockets? But Tariq was onto something big. His designs caught on like wildfire, especially with young Qataris who wanted to honor their heritage while still looking cool. The timing couldn't have been better. Qatar's luxury goods market was about to explode. In 2010, the luxury market in Qatar was worth about $600 million. By 2020, that number had skyrocketed to over $2 billion, and Tariq's brand, Desert Chic, was riding that wave all the way to the top. Today, Tariq Al Jaber is worth an estimated $2.9 billion. His fashion empire includes high-end boutiques across the Middle East and Europe. But you want to hear about his crown jewel? It's this insane diamond thobe that's basically a walking piece of art. We're talking hand-embroidered with real diamonds and gold thread. The price tag? A cool $1.5 million. Desert Chic now has a total brand value of over $5 billion. Tariq's clothes are worn by everyone from Qatari royalty to Hollywood celebrities, but even with all that success, he hasn't forgotten his roots. He still keeps a small fabric stall in Souk Waqif, where he goes sometimes to feel the textures and remember where it all started. From measuring out yards of fabric to dressing the world's elite. Now that's what you call weaving success from whole cloth. Tariq took a dying trade and turned it into a fashion empire that's got people rocking traditional styles with a modern twist.